Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you for everybody who's attending today. Hopefully I'll get you some useful information. Ashley sort of teased it in the email she sent out, but I do generally write the test for the local and for the Area 2 competition, although I'll probably get some help this year. So a lot of the stuff that you see on here, it's got a pretty good chance of showing up on the test somewhere as well too. That's not to say that everything we go over today is going to be on the test, or that I'm covering everything today that might be on the test. As if you've read through the learning objectives for soils or for any of the topics in Envirothon, you'll see that they are very complex and voluminous. So there's a lot of stuff that could be on the test. But this will be a good subset that will at least introduce you to some of the things and some of the concepts you can expect to find partially on the tests at the next two levels of the competition. So I always like to start off with a bit of a conceptual idea of soil. We kind of all understand in our heart of hearts what soil is, but I think sometimes that understanding is a little bit mistaken. So really, when we're talking about soil, we're talking about a material that exists at the intersection of the three spheres of matter right at the surface of the earth, the skin of the earth, if you will. So what are those three spheres? Well, we've got our hydrosphere, our lithosphere, and our atmosphere. Our hydrosphere is all of our water from big bodies of recognizable water, the oceans, the rivers and lakes that we see, Potomac, Chesapeake, things like that, but also those much smaller bodies, little tiny tributaries, perennial or intermittent streams that run through your backyard. Um, Water stored in the soil as groundwater, or little droplets of water up in the atmosphere as water vapor or clouds. That's all part of the hydrosphere. We lump all of that together. Even the ice on the ice caps is part of the hydrosphere as well too. The lithosphere is our rock, both solid and decomposed into sediments. No matter where you are in the world, if you dig down deep enough, you will eventually hit the lithosphere. You will hit solid rock. It depends where you are. The depth to which you have to dig will vary greatly from one spot to another. So for those of you who live in eastern Loudoun County and western Fairfax County, you might only have to dig down 2 or 3 feet on average to hit bedrock. Where I'm standing in kind of central Fairfax County, you might have to go down 10 or 20 feet. And if anybody is joining us from the eastern part of Fairfax or parts of Prince William County as well, too, closer to the Potomac, you might have to go down 200, 300 feet before you hit bedrock. But eventually, no matter where you are, no matter how deep you have to dig, you will eventually hit that solid rock, the lithosphere. And then, of course, we've got the atmosphere, which is the air above us. And where all three of these spheres intersect right at the surface of the earth, right at the skin, that's where we get soil. And this concept is important because soil really is a combo of these three spheres. It's not solid material. It's a mix of solids, liquids, and gases. And it's important to remember that when you're looking at healthy soil. So what we find again is that healthy soil, consists of only about 50% solid material. So it's only half solids. And then the rest is pretty much evenly divided between air, or what we call the soil's atmosphere, and water. And these proportions will change from day to day. For instance, we've gotten quite a bit of rain this past week, so our water percentage is probably a little bit higher, and as a result, our air percentage is probably a little bit less. If we dig a soil in the middle of July, when we've had 2 or 3 dry, hot weeks, what we'll find is there's going to be more air and less water in that soil. So these things fluctuate depending on the temperature and the weather. But this is a good annual average for healthy topsoil: 25% by volume air, 25% by volume water, and 50% solids. And even those solids, we can break those down, subdivide them a little bit. So about 45% of our soil is mineral solids, basically weathered bedrock, and about 5% is organic material. So we take 45% by volume minerals, 5% organic solids, 25% air, 25% water. That's our basic recipe for healthy topsoil. Now, if we were to dig down into the soil solids a little bit more, even though they're only 50% of the soil, perhaps less than we might have originally thought. They're still very important. It's important to understand what makes up that fraction of the soil. So we could actually break down those soil solids again into the mineral and organic fraction. So again, mineral fraction, about 45% of our soil volume. It consists of three things only: sand, silt, and clay. Um, Sand, silt, and clay determine what we call the soil's texture. Um, the soil's texture is a very important physical characteristic of the soil. It it's a well-named characteristic because the texture really determines how the soil feels, but that's not why it's really important. The soil's texture affects the ability of the soil to hold nutrients, to hold water, to allow water and oxygen from the surface to pass from the surface down into the rooting zone of the soil. All those things are affected by the soil's texture. But soil texture is a fairly simple concept. It's just the percentage of sand, silt, and clay. You add those three percentages up and they equal 100%. What is the difference between sand, silt, and clay? Well, the difference is particle size. So you could have an identical mineral, and it could be a particle of sand, a particle of silt, a particle of clay. The content of the mineral doesn't matter. The atoms, the molecules that make it up. It's the size of that individual particle that matters. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture defines sand as any mineral particle with a diameter between 2 and 0.05 millimeters. And these numbers aren't really important. It's just more, what's important is knowing the difference between them, the relative difference between them. So sand is 2 to 0.05 millimeters in diameter. Silt is any mineral particle in the soil that's between 0.05 and 0.002 millimeters in diameter. And then clay is any mineral particle less than 0.002 millimeters. What does that mean, really? 0.002 millimeters is the same as saying 2 microns, 2 millionths of a meter. What in effect this says is that clay is tiny. It's microscopic, 100% microscopic and very microscopic. So you would need a powerful microscope, like an electron microscope, to see an individual particle of clay. Silt is sort of the mineral sized particle, still microscopic, so you'd still need a microscope to see it, but it's not nearly as small as clay. And sand is the biggest, and it bridges the gap between microscopic and visible to the naked eye. So of course, a 2 millimeter diameter piece of sand, you can see that with your eye without the aid of any magnification. It's not particularly big, but you can see it. As we start verging down to the really small particles of sand, 0.05 millimeters, that's when you do need a microscope in order to see them. But really, the important thing is sand is a lot bigger than silt, which is a lot bigger than clay. So even though all three of these seem relatively small compared to, say, the human body, the human hand, whatever it is, the differences between them in terms of size are quite great. That's 45% of our soil right there, the mineral fraction, sand, silt, and clay. 5% is the organic fraction. So anything living in the soil, we consider to be part of the soil, whether that's a beetle, an earthworm, the roots of the plants themselves, or the much more numerous but much smaller and invisible to the naked eye microscopic stuff, those billions and billions of bacteria, fungi, protists, and other microbes living in the soil. So for every teaspoon of topsoil, it's estimated there's anywhere from about 100 million to a billion bacteria residing within. And there's these tons and tons of, we call them fungal root hairs or hyphae. Most soil fungi can be single-celled, but most soil fungi is multicellular and exists as these little microscopic white roots that grow through the soil. If we were to take that teaspoon of healthy topsoil and extract all the roots and lay them end to end to end, they would stretch anywhere from about 40 yards to 40 miles per teaspoon, which is just to say that there's a tremendous amount of stuff alive in the soil, but most of it is invisible to us because it's in that microscopic realm. Living material, and then we can further subdivide the organic fraction into the dead material. Those would be the leaves and sticks and twigs and manures and dead animals that fall down to the soil surface. The dead animals inside the soil, all those things living within the soil, they live quickly and die young, and they decompose within the soil as well too, adding to that dead organic fraction. The dead organic material is very important as well too, because it is the food source for the living organic fraction. So all those bacteria and fungi and the bigger stuff, the base of their food web is dead organic material. That's where the energy, the organic carbon comes from that powers the soil food web, the food web below our feet. So we sort of have to redefine our definition of soil. Is it the intersection of the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, and the atmosphere? Yeah, it is. Is it a mix of sand, silt, and clay? And organic matter, I should add. Yeah, it is. But it also has to host life. Soil isn't considered a soil until life is within it and on it. So it's not just the life that we can see, the plants growing out, who put their roots down into the soil but have their showy, shoots and leaves above ground. It's also all those bacteria, fungi, and other critters that live down in the soil, just out of sight, but just a few inches below our feet. So speaking of that soil food web, another very important component of soil are the cycles that soil powers. And two of those cycles are really kind of the same cycle, the nutrient cycle and the carbon cycle. And for the most part, we can really think of these as the same thing, because whenever organic carbon is cycling around the soil food web, there's a whole pool of nutrients that are sort of hitched on along for the ride as well too. So where carbon cycles, nutrients are also cycling. So as I mentioned before, dead organic matter is the base of the soil food webs. So this is a simplified illustration of the soil food web, but it really does begin down there at the organic matter. And this dead organic matter is being added again by falling leaves, twigs, branches, manures, dead animals. But surprisingly, plants actually exude or sort of spray out a lot of organic matter directly through their roots. And they do this in order to increase the activity of the bacteria and fungi and other microbes and decomposers within the soil. Because if there's lots of those little microbial decomposers active in the soil, they are helping to power up the nutrient cycle. So the plants kind of have this pretty smart way of goosing the nutrient and carbon cycles by adding organic carbon and thus creating more food for the microbes in the soil and increasing their populations. The next level, I'll kind of, again, it's already simplified, but I'll simplify it even more by saying the next level of the soil food web are those groups that process organic matter, the decomposers and the shredders. The shredders, I'll start with them first because they're fairly simple. They are exactly as their name implies. They're little critters that take pieces of organic matter and shred it up into smaller sizes. This doesn't sound like it would be that important, but the finer you shred something, the more surface area you make on that material. The more surface area there is, the easier it is for bacteria and fungi to sort of attach onto it and then break it down. So the example I use is if you throw a log into a compost pile, that log will eventually break down, but it's probably going to take 5 or 10 years. If you take that log and grind it up into wood chips and throw that into a compost pile, that can break down within probably a year, maybe even less. And the only thing that's changed is the amount of surface area that the decomposers can attach to. So those are the shredders. They break down material, create more surface area, and this allows the decomposers to get to work. The decomposers are really probably the most important part. Other than the dead organic matter, which is the base of the soil food web, the decomposers are probably the most important part of the food web because they are the ones that break down that organic matter. They eventually break it down into something we call soil humus, Humus, not hummus, Hummus, but humus, Humus. Soil humus is that nice dark organic material that stains the soil dark brown, cocoa brown colors. Humus is the resistant material that is left after the fungi and bacteria have broken down and eaten all the easy to decompose portions of the organic matter. The important part about the decomposers is as they break material down, they take a lot of energy, of course, but they also take a lot of nutrients from the organic matter that they're feasting on, and they concentrate it in their bodies. So the fungi and bacteria concentrate things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, iron, zinc, all those essential nutrients within their bodies after they break down that organic matter. And the rest of the group, I'm going to simplify it as the liberators of nutrients. So these are sort of the big group of things that prey on fungi and bacteria and those lower level consumers. Well, remember the fungi and bacteria just ate all that organic matter and now they are stuffed full, highly concentrated of good, full of nutrients. Now, these higher level predators want some of those nutrients. They also want the organic matter that's in the fungi and bacteria that gives them energy. And when they eat fungi and bacteria, though, they get their organic energy, but they also get all these nutrients. However, they don't store the nutrients in their body to nearly the same concentration that the fungi and bacteria store it in their body. What this means is when a protozoa or a nematode, for instance, eats a fungi or bacteria, it's getting more nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and the like than it actually needs. So what does it do with that extra? It excretes it. It poops it out. And in that poop, that's new dead organic material, and it's full of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and all that other good stuff too. But those nutrients are now in a form that can dissolve, basically can become soluble or dissolve in the soil water. That's very important because there's only two things that plants take up out of the soil. They take up oxygen and they take up water. So the plants need their nutrients dissolved in that water. They need it in soluble form if they're going to be able to take it up. And that's really what these nutrient liberators do. They feast on the fungi and bacteria. They take in all that nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. They don't need all of it, so they excrete extra through their waste. And in that excretion is lots of that good nutrient that is now in soluble form that dissolves in the water and is taken up by the plant roots. So that kind of in a nutshell is the nutrient cycle. And you have to remember, when there's a pool of nutrients cycling around, there's a much larger attached pool of carbon cycling around as well too. Your average fungi or bacteria wants a food source that has about 24 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen, which means that basically if a molecule of nitrogen is floating around, there's probably at least 24 parts carbon attached to it floating around as well too. That gives you an idea of the scale of these two cycles, but they are really intertwined. They're basically the same cycle. All right, that might be more detail than you need, but hopefully it gives you a rough idea of the important things that are happening in the soil food web and how that relates to global nutrient cycling. Let's do a quick recap. You can think of the soil as the skin of the earth, where the hydrosphere, lithosphere, and atmosphere all combine together. It's about 50% solid, 25% air, and 25% water. Those solids are composed of mineral material, sand, silt, and clay, and organic material, living and dead. And soil is also a very complex ecosystem and food web that cycles carbon and nutrients on a global scale. How does soil form? Well, it's a slow process. Any sort of geologic process is not one that occurs overnight. Um, you see rocks and such that are billions of years old. It doesn't take billions of years to create soil, but it does take a very long time, especially when compared to the human lifespan. So we have to basically take solid rock and raw organic matter and break it down. Break the rock into sand, silt, and clay, break the organic matter down into soil humus, and that's how you get modern soil, actual soil. So breaking down that bedrock, that's going to be a really slow process. If you think about a chunk of granite bedrock, think about Yosemite National Park, all those big mountains there, El Capitan and stuff, that's just solid granite. Stuff's pretty tough. It's going to take a long time to break something like that down into little 2 millimeter or smaller sizes of sand, silt, and clay. Organics, it's a faster process. You throw a banana peel into your compost pile, it's going to start browning within about an hour or so. But actually, by the time the organic matter becomes soil humus, again, that's the resistant material that's left after all the easily decomposed stuff has been broken down and incorporated into the bodies of the microbes, the bacteria and fungi. Soil humus can actually stay pretty much intact in the soil, slowly degrading the whole time, but it'll persist in the soil for 50 or 100 years sometimes. With those two processes combined, it's estimated that it takes about 100 to 500 years to create every inch of soil. And around here, we can often have 3-4 feet of soil in some cases. So those soils with those depths have been sitting and weathering in place for minimum thousands and thousands of years. So say this is a nice soil profile from Loudoun County. We're looking at about 42 inches of soil here. If we go with a long route and say each one of these inches took 500 years to create, does that mean that the soil is 21,000 years old? It's possible. The importance between, but to think, it's important to know how long it takes to create soil because it shows that soil is somewhat fragile. If you see after a rainstorm that muddy, chocolate brown water flowing down our streams and our rivers, well, obviously we don't want all that sediment in our streams and rivers. But you also have to think that that is potentially hundreds of years of natural soil formation that has just been eroded off a farm field, a backyard, maybe a playground somewhere. And it's going to take a long time in order to replenish that soil that just eroded down into that stream or that river. So erosion is troublesome for two ways, both from the water quality impacts and the loss of soil, which can be regained, but only very, very slowly. What are the factors, though, the natural forces behind soil formation that creates those new inches of soil, but also behind the variability we see in soil, the difference from soils from one spot to another? It goes by the rather inarticulate acronym CLORPT. It doesn't roll off the tongue exactly, but if you can remember CLORPT, you can remember the 5 soil forming factors. And I pretty much guarantee that some question about the 5 soil forming factors is going to find its way onto at least one of the 2 tests you all might be taking soon. So what makes up that acronym? Well, the first soil forming factor is CL. That stands for climate, basically your temperature and precipitation patterns for the area. O stands for organisms. R is relief. Relief is another word for your topography, your landscape position. Where are you in the landscape? Where is that soil forming? Top of a hill, steep slope, down on a floodplain. P is apparent material. That is the material, the raw material from which the soil forms, the bedrock that it forms from. The sediments that are deposited in a floodplain and are left to sit there and form new soils. Sometimes sediments are blown in by wind as well, too. Not so much around here, but if you've seen the Dust Bowl, you can see the central part of the U.S. does have dust storms, and so do many other parts of the world where wind can be an important gatherer of parent material or displacer of parent material, as the case were. And then T is time. It's sort of a master variable. It takes, again, 100 to 500 years for climate, organisms, relief, and parent material to break down and weather that raw parent material into the layers of highly formed soil that we see out in the field nowadays. So what do each of these factors affect? Well, this is going to be, of course, a very gross simplification of what they do, but here's the broad strokes. So climate really determines the rate and extent of weathering. And the basic pattern we see is that in areas with hotter, rainier climates, things break down faster. Sort of the prototypical example of this would be the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. They have very, very weathered, very deep soils there. Not particularly fertile, but very, very highly weathered. Because it's raining every day there, it's constantly hot and never get a snow day there. And as a result of this warm, moist environment, both organic matter and bedrock breaks down at a much faster rate than it would in, say, Alaska, or even here in sort of our temperate Virginia climate. Organisms, so not organics, but organisms. And this refers to things that grow on the soil, meaning plants, as well as things living in the soil, your microbes, your bacteria, your fungi, your other burrowing critters. Organisms are responsible for additions and breakdown of organic matter and the cycling of nutrients and carbon. And I won't get into this too much because I kind of explained it during the slide that had the soil food web on it. But obviously, plants are sort of the big adders of organic matter to the soil. But once that organic matter gets added, it gets processed, munched on, digested, decomposed, and passed through the various layers of the soil food web. And this causes a cycling of nutrients and carbon, which eventually allows important nutrients to cycle back to the plants and power new growth. Relief. Your landscape position, your topography, this really has an important effect on erosion and drainage. And this one is probably the most obvious, the most understandable of the 5 soil forming factors. Where would you expect to find your deepest soil? Well, not on a really steep slope, because on steep slopes, That's just an area that's naturally prone to erosion. So a soil will form there, but it's probably never going to get very thick because every time you have a heavy rainfall, a little bit of that soil gets washed and stripped off the top via erosion of water flowing down that steep slope at a high rate of speed. Where might you find a really deep soil? Well, down at the bottom of that slope. Maybe there's a floodplain down there, or even if just the slope flattens out, that eroding water, that eroded sediment that eroded off the slope has nowhere to go, so it settles and it causes material to build up down at the base of the hill. So that soil can get very, very deep. Drainage is an obvious one as well too. Generally, the higher elevation you are, the drier your soil is going to be. As you go downhill, and flatten out into our valleys and floodplains. If you're at a low elevation that collects water, you're probably going to have a soil that's has more moisture and potentially high groundwater as well too. Parent material. So we get our traits from our parents, things like height, eye color, hair color, skin color, things like that. Soil gets a lot of its traits from the rock or sediment from which it weathers. So a lot of the chemical traits, pH, things like that, the concentration of nutrients, the color of the soil, the texture of the soil, the sand, silt, and clay percentage, a lot of that has to do with what the original parent material was. So for instance, here in Fairfax County and Loudoun as well too, um, certain bedrock will weather into soil that has a really high clay content. And that can be right next to another type of bedrock that weathers at the same rate, but it breaks down into a soil that is really, really sandy. And these two soils can be right next to each other. They feel very, very different. And the only reason that they are different is because of that differing parent material down below. And then, of course, lastly, time, your master variable. It takes a lot of time for those four previous factors to affect any change. Soil formation isn't something that happens overnight. It's something that happens over years and years and years. But generally, what we see is that an older soil is usually a deeper, more weathered soil because it just takes a lot of time for climate, organisms, relief, and parent material to break down organic matter, to break down bedrock and turn it into highly developed soil layers. So some of the soil variability that you can see, thanks to the work of those five soil forming factors, includes things like the color of the soil, its depth, its chemical makeup and nutrient content. So is it a fertile soil, a non-fertile soil? Is it acidic? Is it basic? The age of the soil, the depth to groundwater, the depth to bedrock, all that stuff traces back to one or sometimes multiple of the five soil forming factors. And because of the differing intensities of these soil forming factors, or slight variations in one factor or another or multiple factors from spot to spot, we get a lot of variety in soil. So people who don't understand soil just think it's plain brown dirt. But what we'll find is that the soil in your backyard may be quite different from the soil just 3 or 4 houses down, and that can be very different than the soil on the other side of your neighborhood, the other side of your school, or the other side of the country. So there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of soil types out there. And each of those little variations we see with them traces back to variations in the five soil forming factors. So the five soil forming factors create soil, but they create a whole variety of soil as well too, a very wide variety. It's not just plain brown dirt. And if we were to look at soil variety on the somewhat local scale, I'll call it the Northern Virginia scale, what we'll see is on this region, the regional scale differences we see in soil across Northern Virginia are mostly exclaimed. I put this, it's really, well, let me put it this way. Big regional scale changes are climate. So why does the soil in California differ from the soil in Alaska, differ from the soil in Puerto Rico? Well, there's probably a lot of different reasons, but one of the big ones is climate. Each of those places has a very different climate. And even if they had the exact same organisms, relief, parent material, and the soil had been sitting there for the same amount of time, because of that change in climate, you'd see different soil types in those three locations. At the more local scale, meaning Northern Virginia or even smaller than that, it's really relief and parent material that account for differences from spot to spot to spot. Relief kind of makes the local regional scale differences. So why is the soil in Western Loudoun different from the soil in Eastern Fairfax and Prince William County? whereas relief makes the really small scale changes. Why is the soil at the top of that hill different from the soil at the bottom of the hill 300 yards away? So this map shows you a few of the different bedrock types, parent material types, that we'll find throughout the local area. And within each of those parent material types, you're going to have slightly different soil than the other parent materials. Um, Within each parent material, you're also going to have different soil. So, just because Western Loudoun County is within what we call the Blue Ridge geologic area, and it has, rocks that are fairly reproducible throughout, it doesn't mean that all the soils there are the same. There's going to be a lot of variety in Western Loudoun. And the same goes for any of these areas of unique geology, unique bedrock. The variety that we see within each of these unique areas of parent material is usually due to um, the changes in relief. So just as an example, this is what we call a soil katina. So this soil, these are profiles, actual profiles, and it's a little hard to see online. This was real profiles of a soil that were pretty much formed right next to each other over about a span of about 100 yards in distance from the top soil to the bottom soil down there in the wetland. But we can see, if we look closely, that there are changes in these soil profiles that are visible to us. For instance, the thickness of the topsoil. It's that dark layer on the surface. We start up at the top of the hill, it's pretty thin. We get a little lower in elevation, that topsoil thickness is beginning to get a little bit bigger, even a little bit bigger as we get down to the edge of the wetland. And by the time we get into the really wetland, it's actually gone much, much thicker, probably several times thicker than what we saw at the top of the hill. So this is a very small scale change due entirely to relief. So the parent material of these soils is probably all the same. The organisms living within them are probably very similar as well too. The relief change, the parent materials are the same, and the time to take them is the same. Climate's obviously the same too. There's not going to be a difference in climate from the top of a small hill down to the bottom. So the only thing that's really changed here is relief. And this shows you just one of the things that can change in a soil type as you go over small scale changes in relief from the top of a hill to the bottom. So with all these factors, these 5 soil forming factors interacting and working on the soil and breaking it down and creating a huge variety of soil, what does a well-weathered, well-formed, well-developed soil look like out in the field? Well, it's kind of like a layer cake. It consists of layers, and each one of these layers we call a soil horizon. These are all the layers you might possibly find in a soil. That doesn't mean that every soil is going to have each of these layers, but this is the maximum amount of layers that you can find in any of our soils around here. So this is a good thing to memorize as well too, in addition to the 5 soil forming factors, because undoubtedly you will be asked about soil layers in the field during some portion of the soils test at the actual competition. So here's a nice profile of a soil. Going from top to bottom, let's discuss what horizons or what soil layers we can see. So the first one there is the O horizon. The O horizon is basically your surface litter of partially decomposed organic matter. So if you dig down between the blades of those grass, what you'll see lying on the surface of the soil are little broken down pieces of grass blades that maybe got mowed off, little broken pieces of leaf material, other twigs, organic material that's beginning to darken, beginning to decompose, beginning to show signs of microbial decomposition. Usually they darken as a result of this as well too. That is your O horizon. Think of O as standing for organic, partially decomposed, 100% organic material. You can usually tell what the original material was. Oh, this is a broken down leaf. Oh, this is a decomposing stick. They usually haven't decomposed so much that you can't tell what they originally were. Then we have our A horizon. That's our first subsurface layer. This is where most people think of the soil as starting. It's very rich in organic material, and it's almost always this dark black cocoa brown type color. That's because as organic material in the O horizon decomposes, it decomposes into soil humus, and that soil humus is black in color. So areas that have a lot of humus, like the A horizon does, tend to be stained dark black or brown. So you can often tell where the A horizon starts and stops based upon its color, based upon where that dark color ends. Um, this picture I like because it shows the A horizon really well. However, it seems to indicate that the A horizon is thicker than it actually is. Around here, Virginia, you're lucky to get 2 or 4 inches of A horizon. That's just naturally what happens in our climate. We don't develop very thick A horizons. So keep that in mind when you're looking through a soil. If you think you found the bottom of the A horizon, but it's 20 inches below the surface, I think you're probably wrong, because generally speaking, a thick A horizon around here is going to be about 5 or 6 inches, and that's thick. 2 to 4 is more the average. So usually the bottom of the A horizon is going to be pretty shallow, pretty close to the surface. This is one of the rarer horizons locally, the E horizon. The E horizon does not exist in all of our soils. In fact, I'd say it exists in probably less than half of the ones that you can see around here. But if you do find it, what you'll see is it usually forms right below the A horizon, and it's got kind of a leached, almost pale color. It's almost like you took an A horizon, but then washed out all of the dyes that gave it that nice dark color. And what you're left behind is kind of a washed out, grayish, dull looking layer. This one's pretty extreme. Usually if you do see an E horizon, it's going to be much more subtle than this one, and it'll look more like an A horizon that's been through the washing machine too many times and the dye is all bled out. But the E horizon is aptly named because the E stands for exit. It's the layer where things have leached or washed out. Up in the A horizon and in the O, there's lots of decomposition occurring, lots of organic acids being made. Every time it rains, some of those organic acids and that rainfall washes down through the E horizon, and it basically picks up things, dissolves it, and washes them away. So it's the horizon things have exited out of. In particular, so many things have exited out that all the natural stains have been washed out as well too. So you're left behind that leach pale color. Most sand, silt, and clay grains are actually kind of grayish in color. And the only reason we see different colors in the soil is because those grains of sand, silt, and clay get coated with natural stains. Iron oxide is one that makes kind of a reddish orangish color, sometimes brown. And organic matter is another that makes that dark brown and black color. So if you're seeing these gray colors, it usually means that those stains have washed away. So again, think of the E horizon as being the leached layer, things have washed out of it, exited out of it. If you do find an E horizon, it's going to be right below your A, and it's probably going to be about the same thickness as the A horizon, 2 to 4 inches. If you're seeing a really, really thick E horizon, it might be something else, because we just don't get thick E horizons around here. But again, I would say in more than half your soils, you're not going to see an E horizon at all. Instead, you're going to go straight from the A down to the B. B is what a lot of people colloquially call red Virginia clay. If you're seeing kind of rusty red, rusty orange, or even kind of a reddish brown color in your soil, there's a good chance you're in your B horizon. But what really determines a B horizon is clay. If you feel that the soil is getting denser, thicker, heavier, if you feel like the soil is stickier, chances are you're in the B horizon, because the B horizon is the horizon that takes the material that washes out of the top layers and deposits it, collects it. So things are leaching out of the E horizon. Where do they go? Well, they go down and they deposit in the B horizon. So over time, clays and iron oxides build up in the B horizon, giving it that dense, clay, sticky texture and that reddish, orangish, yellowish color. Next is the C horizon, which is sort of your border layer between soil and rock. If you have a C horizon, if you dig down deep enough to find it, what you'll usually find is that the clay content begins to drop. So that clay increase that we saw in the B horizon reverses. As you get down to the C, the soil starts feeling drier, looser, more powdery, sometimes more gritty, but less sticky and dense because the clay content is decreasing. Oftentimes you will see a color change, but not always. It can be, I'd say the border between the B and C is usually the toughest one to define, the toughest one to see in the field, because it can be very gradual. And sometimes the C horizon has almost the same colors as the B horizon. But if you're feeling the soil getting lighter, looser, drier, and just generally less sticky feeling, chances are you're in the C horizon. If you see that, plus there's a color change, that's an even better indication that you're in the C horizon. The C horizon is basically the first layer that weathers off the bedrock down below. So if you imagine like you're an artist, a sculptor with your chiseling tools, and you're just chiseling away at a big chunk of marble. The sea horizon is basically the dusty material that accumulates at your feet as you're chiseling away at that big chunk. It's pulverized bedrock that hasn't weathered enough to chemically change. So it's physically weathered, but not chemically weathered. So the sea horizon is basically just chewed up bedrock that no longer adheres to itself. It's soft now, but it hasn't physically changed chemically changed into any other thing. It hasn't chemically weathered. It's still the same materials, just not adhered into one solid chunk like a piece of bedrock is. And of course, if you go down below the sea horizon, eventually you will hit the R horizon. R stands for rock. What does soil look like? Well, other than the layers, soil actually clumps together into these little solids that we call peds. Peds are basically when you're digging through the soil and you have a clod of soil in your hand, that's a soil ped. It's those visible clumps of soil that you can pull out of the ground with your own hand. So they're all macroscopic. You can see them with your eye. They're not microscopic things. You wouldn't think that the way soil clumps is important, but it actually is. And we'll get into the importance a little bit. But here are some of the styles of ped you might find. A lot of times up in the A horizon, we get this little granular ped. It looks a lot like grape nut cereal, if anybody's ever had that, but of course it's darker. Now we get down to the B horizon, we often have a blocky ped, which again also looks like grape nut cereal, but bigger. It's not so much different in shape than the granular peds, it's just different in terms of its size. Each of these blocky peds is larger than each of those little granules. If we have a compacted urban soil, meaning a soil that's been squished down by a heavy weight, which we have a lot of in urban areas, you might find this platy structure right here. This is what happens when you take these nice loose granules and loose blocks and squeeze them under the weight of, let's say, a backhoe or a front end loader or just a lot of foot traffic. Those peds get squished down, flattened into these plates. And then these two other examples here, massive single grain, they're basically structureless soils. Those are soils that are all just one huge chunk, massive, or no adhesion whatsoever, single grain. So it's sort of a lack of structure within those last two examples. Ideally, what we want to see in a healthy soil is granular and blocky structure. We don't want to see that platy structure again, because platy structure is a sign of compaction, and especially around here, it's usually urban, suburban compaction, although you can get compaction out in agricultural areas as well too, from the weight of plows and other farming mechanical equipment. So soil structure, I should say, is what makes this dispersion of materials possible. The reason we can have 25% by volume air and 25% by volume water in our soil is because with a good structured soil, we have these soil peds, these little clumps or aggregates. And between each ped and its neighboring ped, there's a pore space. And within the peds themselves, there are micropores, very, very small capillary type pores. Those pores, by definition, are open space. They're channels, basically. So good structure creates good channels. And the better structure we have, the more channels we have. And it's those channels that allow air and water into the soil. So a well-structured soil will be about 50% channels, both within and between the peds. And that is what allows that 25% air and 25% water to take up residence in the soil. If we didn't have that good structure, there'd be no channels or pore spaces for that air and water to enter and reside in the soil. And as a result, the soil would basically be not all mineral material, but a much higher percentage of mineral soil solids. Soil color can be very important too, because of what it tells us about the soil. It's an important clue when you're analyzing and looking at soil. It can indicate the organic matter content. What we generally find is the darker the colors are within a soil, the higher the organic matter content is. You probably won't ever see a soil like this around here. This is a peat bog in probably, I think it's in Northern Ireland, maybe Scotland. That's pretty much majority organic material. There's some sand, silt, and clay mixed in there too, but it's mostly just decomposed organics. I mean, you just won't find that around here, but That nice dark color from top to bottom is telling you that this soil is chock full of organic material. Other colors can indicate the drainage class of the soil. So if you're seeing a soil like this, reds, yellows, and browns, that's usually a dry soil, because those reds, yellows, and browns are iron oxide. Remember, most minerals in the soil, sand, silt, and clay, are actually gray. So if you're seeing a lot of reds, yellows, and browns, that's an iron oxide coating or stain on those minerals. When iron combines with oxygen, basically rust forms. That's your iron oxide. But iron oxide accumulates in an aerated, a dry environment, well oxygenated environment, not a saturated environment. On the other hand, if you're seeing a lot of splotchy grays mixed in with your soils, that can often be an indication of wetness. It doesn't have to be 100% gray. You can see from this chunk of soil, there's certainly some big blue gray in the center, but around it is kind of a ring of orangey colors, similar to the color we saw in the last soil. If you're seeing this splotchiness or really gray soils throughout, that again is often an indication that that soil is saturated, that all the pore spaces within that soil are full of water for a good portion of the year. And generally, the grayer it is, the more frequently that soil is saturated. How does this come about? Well, it's also iron oxide. So when iron and oxygen combine, you get those reds, yellows, and oranges. When that iron oxide is in a soil that is saturated, all the oxygen in that soil gets used up. And then the iron oxide will dissolve. And as it washes away, that red, orange, yellow color washes away as well too. So what's left behind are the naked colors of the soil minerals, sand, silt, and clay, which is generally gray. So if you're seeing these gray splotches, it means that the soil has been wet enough for that iron oxide to dissolve, wash away, and leave behind that gray splotch. And that is an indicator that your groundwater has risen to whatever level that gray splotch formed at. And remember though, these are general rules. When you're looking at a soil and trying to interpret it, you have to look around, look at the landscape, and combine those two things to make a practical decision. So if you're seeing some gray colors, and this is where it gets confusing because sometimes there's certain bedrock that's just gray and it weathers into fairly gray soil. So if you're at the very top of a tall hill and the steep slopes all around you and you're seeing gray colors in your soil, you might have to say, oh, I think these grays are a result of the bedrock. We must have some gray bedrock and that's forming this color. However, if you're down at the very bottom of a hill next to a stream or a wetland and you're in a very flat environment and you're digging through the soil and seeing gray colors like this, you can be much more certain that those grays are indicators of a high groundwater table and saturation within that soil. So kind of compare what you're seeing to where you are in the landscape to make a well-informed, practical decision. There's a specific type of soil that's very, very wet that actually factors into the definition of a wetland. We call that a hydric soil. With a hydric soil, you're going to find a soil that's poorly drained, meaning the water table is at or very close to the surface for a majority of the year, and the soil is going to be predominantly gray. So not just gray splotches mixed into an otherwise red soil. You're going to see a soil that is mostly gray. Because again, the more gray the soil is, that's an indicator that the soil is saturated for a longer period of time. To be considered a wetland, legal standpoint, to be a protected wetland by the law, you have to have hydric soil. That's one of the three things that goes into being a wetland. Hydric soil, hydrophytic vegetation, which basically means wetland vegetation, and then something else called a wetland hydrology regime, which basically means you've got ponding water on the surface for a portion of the year. If you have just hydric soil and not those other things, it's not considered a legal wetland. If you have all three of those things, legally it is considered a wetland and can be protected from development as a result. So let's go back to that example that we saw of the local scale changes caused by relief. So we saw as we went down from the top of the hill to the wetland at the bottom, our A horizon got thicker. What we'll also can see is that the subsoil color changes. Here it's that nice, all kind of brownish orange color, orangey brown, I guess. But as we start decreasing in elevation, our soil starts getting grayer and grayer. And that's just for the reasons we just talked about. Those iron oxides are beginning to wash away because that soil is getting wetter and wetter for a more and more prolonged period of time until we get down to the wetland, the wettest soil there is. And the reason that the A horizon got thicker is that organic matter tends to decompose at a much slower rate in anaerobic conditions or oxygen-free conditions. It breaks down much faster in well aerated soil, which we'll find at the top of the hill. So it's not that there's a different amount of organic matter being added at the bottom of the hill than the top. Rather, it's just the organic matter tends to accumulate in the wet soils at the bottom because it doesn't break down as quickly as in that well aerated soil at the top of the hill. So let's talk a little bit about the importance of soil. We kind of talked about how it forms, the layers, some of the other things you could see in it, what some of the colors mean, the sandstone clay content. Why do we care though? What does soil do for us, for the world, for the environment as a whole? Well, the first one is kind of an obvious one, so I won't go into it in detail, but it provides physical support. And we've got trees that can easily reach 120, 150 feet. They need to anchor their roots into something fairly solid so that every gust of wind doesn't knock them over. And soil gives us that. Even though it's only 50% solid material, it's still dense material with a lot of bearing support that can hold up the weight of our trees and other large vegetation, hold up the weight of buildings that we build on, roadways, things like that as well too. Where we will get into a little more detail is the water cycle, the nutrient cycle, which is very important for crop growth, and the carbon sequestration or carbon cycle, which helps with crop growth and has a big effect on global warming as well too. And again, really, I'm separating them out here, but the nutrient cycle and the carbon cycle really are the same cycle. Where nutrients are cycling around, carbon is cycling around with it, usually in a much bigger pool. Let's start with the water cycle. We can consider soil to be a sponge in a filter that covers the whole globe. So it's like the world's Brita filter. And we can think of soil or the cycle starting up here as rainfall. And excuse me, when rain hits the surface of the land, it can do one of three things. It can soak down into the soil, it can become surface runoff, or it can evaporate or transpirate. We call that, combine those two things into evapotranspirate back into the atmosphere. From an environmental perspective, ideally what we want to see happen is minimize the amount that becomes surface runoff and maximize the amount that absorbs and soaks down into the soil for two reasons. First one is obvious. Our plant roots are in the soil. They need water. So we need to get the water into the soil so the plant roots have access to them. If all the water becomes runoff, none of that water gets into the soil, the plants will wilt and die. The other important reason is that soil is a really, really great filter. It sounds odd, but if you run dirty water through dirt, it actually comes out cleaner on the bottom. So any water that filters down through the soil has a chance to get filtered. And the reason that that water needs to be filtered is that anything on the surface here can potentially get picked up, pushed along, washed along, eroded, or dissolved within the soil water. Some of those things are perfectly harmless, but some of those things are potential pollutants. Like in our farmland out here, we've got animal manures, we've got fertilizers and pesticides. We certainly don't want that washing down into our waters. Out in our more urbanized suburban areas, we can have, all those same things. People put fertilizers and pesticides on their lawn, of course. We don't have a lot of livestock, but we've got Labrador retrievers and beagles and domestic cats and some wildlife. And we've also got things like Canada geese, and they're leaving waste all over the place. And sometimes we pick up after it and sometimes we don't. We've got motor oil on our roadways, salt on our roadways. All this stuff can get washed away by surface runoff and potentially get washed into our streams and rivers unless it goes into the soil first and gets filtered. So your soil, as this dirty runoff passes through, it might contain some dissolved things like nitrates or phosphates, maybe some bad bacteria like E. coli. Again, might have a little bit of motor oil that washed off the roadway, maybe some pesticides from a lawn or a farm field. Maybe there's some other pathogens, viruses, and things like that that came out of animal waste that didn't get picked up, a pet waste that got left on the curb. We don't want any of that getting down into our groundwater, and our groundwater goes to feed our surface waters too, so we don't want that getting into our surface waters. Well, luckily, within the soil, we've got clay, we've got humus, and we've got microbes. Clay and humus have this odd ability. They're sort of like natural magnets. They can take charged materials and water and bond them not permanently, but temporarily bond them to their surface. And that helps to absorb and remove a lot of this bad stuff that's being washed away through our downward percolating stormwater. And then we've got all these microbes, those billions of bacteria and those miles and miles of fungal root hairs. Well, they are very protective of their turf, and they love nothing more than to kill off bad bacteria and other pathogens that happen to be washing through the soil. So they generally outcompete these bad guys that come washing in um, with surface runoff, and they kill and neutralize them. And then, of course, there's things like motor oil. Motor oil is not healthy, of course. It's not natural, but it is organic by the strict sense of the word, meaning it contains organic carbon. And as long as that motor oil isn't in such a high concentration that it poisons the microbes within the soil, there almost invariably will be some or several species of microbe in there that will be able to munch on that motor oil, break it down, use that organic carbon for their own energy purposes, and then as a result of that decomposition, turn that motor oil into something far less harmful. So the net effect of all of these transformations, microbial breakdowns, the magnetic-like properties of clay and humus is that this dirty water passes through the soil, and by the time it's acted upon by all these forces and gets down to the groundwater, it's been really well filtered. Plus, a lot of the water actually just stays in the soil. Because again, clay and humus in particular are very attractive to water. Water bonds to the surface. So that water stays within the soil, which is good. That means it's available to the plant roots. And that water that remains and percolates all the way down to the groundwater table is good, cleaned, and filtered. Fortunately, we do disturb the water cycle in many ways, especially in urban and suburban areas or anywhere that's undergoing development. We create a lot of imperviousness. Impervious surfaces are any surface that doesn't let water pass through. There's a lot of impervious surfaces in cities and suburbs. Think of rooftops, driveways, concrete, asphalt. And more impervious surfaces we have, the less ability water has to percolate down into the soil and be held and be filtered. We also have a lot of compacted soil. So even if a surface doesn't look impervious, maybe it's your front lawn or your back lawn, chances are the soil in there is not 100% natural like it was. It's probably been run over by some grading machinery at some point in the past when your neighborhood was developed. This takes that nice, loose, low density, high porosity, well-structured soil, and maybe it's packed it down into those tightly packed platey clods that we saw in urban soil. As a result, a lot of the pore spaces have been squeezed out. Those pore spaces are what allow water and oxygen to percolate down into the soil. So the fewer pore spaces we have, the less ability that compacted soil has to absorb water. So it's not fully impervious. It's kind of like an impervious light material. The net result of all this imperviousness and compacted soil is that not the same volume of water that would absorb into soil in a very natural area like a forest or a park is not allowed to do that. It's prevented from entering the soil, and as a result, a lot more becomes stormwater runoff. If the water doesn't enter the soil, it doesn't have a chance to be filtered. So that stormwater runoff is carrying quite a bit of pollutant that gets washed off our land surfaces. Maybe it's fertilizer or pesticide or animal wastes. This large volume of somewhat polluted runoff then is directed right into our streams and rivers. And we've actually created a system to make this more efficient. We've got all those gutters on the side of the road. Those gutters go down into a pipe, and that pipe eventually drains to the nearest stream. So we're taking more runoff. We're creating an easy path for it to flow into our streams. And as a result, every time we have a decent rain, it's almost like we have a little flash flood that goes flowing through our stream channels. This causes our stream channels to erode wider and deeper. That's my boss, Willie Wood, right there. He's about 6'6", so he's a very tall guy. And you can see this stream that he's standing in. The bank is about 3 or 4 feet higher than his head, and the bottom of the stream is about 2 feet below his feet. This is a very unnatural stream bank. This is a stream that's been urbanized, and as a result, it's beginning to erode. If you see these tall, straight, cliff-like stream channels with bare soil on the side, that's a sure sign that a lot of the soil here has been washed away because of high flows, especially if you see these roots hanging out in the air. Roots don't grow above air. So these roots have been uncovered. They used to be in the ground and now they're hanging out. Doesn't seem like this would be a huge deal, but we've got thousands and thousands of miles of these little streams working our way through all of our local counties. And as a result, every time it rains, even if just a fraction of a millimeter gets stripped off, eroded off these banks, you add it all up with all the other stream channels, that's thousands and thousands of tons of sediment that's eroding away from our streams and washing down into our streams and rivers. And all that eventually goes off to the Potomac and then the Chesapeake. So let's get back to the nutrient and carbon cycle now. That was the water cycle, and the other two important cycles are the nutrient cycle and the carbon cycle. This brings us back to the soil food web. And what's the base of the soil food web? It's organic matter. Organic matter, of course, contains lots and lots and lots of organic carbon. So leaf fall, trees falling over, dead animals, manures, twigs and branches falling off, all that adds to the organic matter being deposited into the soil. And that is the base of the soil food web. So that organic matter is chock full of organic carbon as well as nutrients. These eventually make their way up to the fungi and bacteria who decompose that organic matter, turn it into soil humus. And as a result of the decomposition process and then other organisms eating those fungi and bacteria, nutrients then are spread out in soluble forms, dissolvable forms throughout the soil, and are thus able to be taken up by our plants. So really, the decomposers play an outsized role, even though they're microscopic, in cycling both carbon and nutrients. So as they take organic matter in, they decompose it, and through several steps, and then the predation upon them themselves, that nutrient that was locked up within that organic carbon is liberated and dissolved in the water in the soil, and then the plants can take it up through their roots and add to their new shoots, new leaves, new twigs, new fruits and vegetables. And this is the base of our terrestrial soil food web. So those well-growing plants are munched upon by other organisms, rabbits, white-tailed deer. Some of those fall prey to our predators, coyotes, foxes, things like that. And really what they're doing is just taking those nutrients that were originally in the soil, that were liberated by the decomposers, picked up by the plants, and they're passing them up through different layers of our above ground food web, not soil food web. Everything has to die eventually, and when it does, what happens to the carcass? It returns back to the soil, and it's broken down by the decomposers, and the nutrients return from whence they came. And of course, as does the carbon as well too. So whenever a nutrient is running around, remember that soil bacteria likes a food source that has about 24 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And nitrogen is the nutrient they take up in the highest volume. So when they're taking up nutrients, they're also cycling around a carbon pool that's at least 24 times larger than the pool of nutrients that are cycling around in the nutrient cycle. So that twin carbon cycle is much, much larger in terms of the volume and weight of material being transferred around. For the carbon cycle as a whole, on a planetary basis, what we find is soil is a carbon sink, which means it takes in more organic carbon than it puts out. When organic carbon is added to the soil and is broken down by bacteria and fungi, we find about 50% of it becomes carbon dioxide and returns to the atmosphere, but the other 50% stays in the soil as long-term storage, usually mostly as soil humus. So about 50% of it stays in there for the long period, 50, 100, 150 years in some cases. Now, what's important about this is that we can tweak the carbon cycle in good ways or bad. Modern farming, or really any sort of soil management, can increase or decrease our global carbon storage within our soils. Obviously, from an environmental perspective, we want to increase it because the more carbon we store in our soils, the less becomes carbon dioxide up in the atmosphere. But from a soil health perspective, we want to increase it as well too, because a soil with a lot of organic carbon is generally a healthy soil. So one thing that we have done and have been doing for the last 12,000 years or so, since we've become an agricultural race of species, is that we till. And when we till our soils, which is basically taking the top 6 to 12 inches of soil and flipping it over, we do that to control weeds. And it's very good at doing that, but it also really disturbs the carbon and nutrient cycle. Because when we flip that soil over, it's bare. All that good humus that was stored, somewhat protected underground, is now exposed to the surface, and the much higher concentration of oxygen that we find in our above ground atmosphere compared to our soil atmosphere. So that flipped over soil begins to decompose. The organic carbon within it begins to break down much faster when it's exposed to the surface. In addition, on this farm field, if let's say the day or two after this farmer tilled, if there was a very big storm, there's nothing covering that soil anymore. So we're going to see a lot of topsoil erosion as a result. Having a vegetated mass on the surface is really great at preventing erosion. Bare soil erodes easily, planted soil does not. We also have a loss of microbes. Those plow blades are basically like knives working their way through the soil. And when they do, they tend to cut up, especially the fungi, because remember, fungi exist as those long, thin root hairs. So they get chopped up by the plow blade, and this kills them and reduces their number significantly. We also tend to suppress microbes in our agricultural production. And this is because plants, kind of like us, are somewhat lazy. When a farmer fertilizes his or her field, like is being shown here, the plant can easily access that added fertilizer and get all the nitrogen, phosphorus, and whatnot that it needs. If it's not getting nitrogen, phosphorus through fertilizer applications, what it does is send organic matter down into the soil through its roots, so it increases the energy and size of the microbe population, specifically bacteria and fungi. It does this so that those microbes break down organic matter and return nutrients to the plant. If the plant's getting all those nutrients for fertilizer, it doesn't bother to put nearly as much organic matter into the soil because it doesn't need to increase the microbe population. It's getting all those nutrients that it needs. So it's sort of like the difference between, let's say you're hungry. What is it easier to do? Go to Taco Bell or make tacos yourself? Well, of course, it's easier to go to Taco Bell, have someone else make it for you. If we are giving the plant its needs through fertilization, it's not going to increase the organic carbon content of the soil in order to increase the microbial population of the soil, because it already has what it needs. So it doesn't need to exert that extra energy to increase the microbial population. As a result, the microbes tend to get suppressed in highly fertilized soils. And then, of course, the other problem, the even bigger problem with over-fertilization, is we get something called eutrophication, which is what happens when we add too much nitrogen, phosphorus, and other fertilizers to a soil. Some of it washes off or dissolves down into our groundwater, and that dissolved fertilizer then flows out to our surface bodies, streams, rivers, lakes, bays, estuaries. What happens here is same thing that happens when fertilizer is added to soil. It stimulates plant growth. But in water, plants that grow are things like algae and the lily pads you see here. This creates a very thick mat of organic growing material on the surface, which blocks out sunlight and can be very bad for any submerged natural vegetation that would have grown there. It's shaded out now. In addition, when all these algae die, um, bacteria breaks them down, but it tends to suck up all of the oxygen that's within the water. And as a result, we get this oxygen-free dead zone, which of course is pretty much entirely deadly for anything that happens to be living within that water. So the new paradigm that is getting pushed on farmers and just smaller property owners as well, anybody who gardens or plants, is to rely less on fertilization plowing and instead manage your soil by trying to feed and encourage growth of the populations of soil microbes, especially your bacteria and your fungi. And the way you do this, is by adding organic matter to your soil. So organic matter, again, is the base of the soil food web. So the more organic matter is added to the soil, the happier and larger your populations of fungi and bacteria are going to be. And these in turn feed the rest of the soil food web. And the more bacteria and fungi you have, again, those guys are really powering the soil nutrient cycle. So if the soil nutrient cycle is up and running really, really well and performing at a high level, there's less need to add fertilizer to your soils. So the Department of Agriculture is now pushing these four main principles of soil health: maximize biodiversity, maximize continuous living roots, maximize soil cover, and minimize soil disturbance. So I know I'm running a little bit late, so I'm going to go through these fast. Maximizing biodiversity. That just means growing a lot of different types of plants, not growing a monoculture, but a variety of things on the surface. Maximize continuous living roots rather than leaving your soil fallow or plowing it up. You ideally want to have things growing on it as much as possible. This is a cover crop. That's a special crop that a farmer puts down on the field just to have living plants growing over the normal fallow periods, fall, winter, into early spring when things aren't normally growing. These crops aren't harvested, rather they're just there to hold the soil in place and add organic matter. And then when it is time to plant the harvestable crops, the farmer can come in with his crimper roller, roll down that cover crop and kill it, but leave it on site. And what happens is that dead cover crop and its roots underneath begin to decompose and add more organic matter to the soil. And the last two I'll lump together: maximize soil cover and minimize disturbance. Basically, anything that you can do to keep living soil, living vegetation on the surface of the soil, or even the stubble of dead vegetation is going to be beneficial. The worst thing you can possibly do for your soil is to leave it bare, because when it's bare, it erodes very easily and the organic matter within the soil is exposed to the atmosphere and it begins to break down faster. It doesn't have to be fancy. It can be as simple as covering your soil with straw or something like that over the winter months when you're not planting anything. And if you're curious about the soils that you have, the best source of comprehensive information is your soil survey. That's a map and data table of the soils that are mapped within your county. You can go to the Web Soil Survey and find those soil surveys for basically any county in the United States. And the data tables within them will describe the physical and chemical properties of the soil. And you also have a lot of ratings of the soil. What is it suitable to be used for, and what is it not suitable to be used for? All right, so sorry for going a little long, but it looks like we stopped right at 6:15, so not too long. Um, I know I threw a lot of information at you, but if you happen to think of something, a question that wasn't answered or a concept that I didn't go over today, by all means, feel free to send an email my way or give me a call at my office and ask whether that question comes later tonight or 2 weeks down, just before the competition. Just let me know and I will do my best to answer it. And that's my contact information there. So thank you all.